Okay, let's get started and walk our way through the civil rights movement relatively briefly. We talked about the legacy leading up to this moment in history after World War II, the legacy of slavery for a century and a half, the legacy of the attempt right after the Civil War to reconstruct the Union on a more equality type basis. The legacy of Jim Crow, which was the reaction against that reconstruction, and set up a two-tiered sort of citizenship in which African Americans were at the bottom, which extended from the 1800s right through the first half of the 20th century, through both world wars. Talked about the legacy of the sharecropping system, which created a virtual economic, not institutional slavery, but economic slavery for many, many people. And how the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, especially the two world wars that occurred, did offer a limited opportunity for African Americans to migrate out of the South, away from exploitative sharecropping and away from strict Jim Crow laws, to places to earn more money than they ever had, working in factories, especially defense factories during both wars. As you can see, to the north, the northeast, the northeastern cities, and the far west coast cities from the south. And the legacy of World War II itself, in which, in particular, the contribution of blacks to the war effort was substantial and significant, and something that was fought for by African American leaders at the beginning of the war, and how President Roosevelt opened up the defense factories by his Executive Order 8802, which created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and how blacks were recruited not only into the factories but into the armed forces, and how African Americans intentionally tried to use these contributions to create something they call double V. We will not only defeat fascism and totalitarianism and lack of rights for many, many people worldwide, to have that translate to better, improved civil rights for African Americans home. People will see the irony of fighting for freedom abroad and denying freedom to certain people here at home. Okay, so we get to the post-war era. Take a couple minutes on that because it's a little bit slow getting started. This is not a slam dunk. As soon as the war's over, let's go out and change the world with civil rights. And as sometimes often happens, the first hint that this was a time of great change happened not in politics or anything like that, but in the world of sports. And a baseball executive by the name of Branch Rickey, who was the president of the Dodgers at the time, looked around and basically said to himself, if a man can go and risk his life or give his life for his country in fighting for freedom, why can't a man who's able to do it play Major League Baseball? And the answer he came up with is there is no good reason. And so Branch Rickey contacted some people, and he finally contacted a veteran soldier, college graduate, a running back from UCLA back before the war, by the name of Jackie Robinson, to be the man to break the color line in Major League Baseball. And he did so. And within weeks, the Cleveland Indians had found another candidate to break the color line in the American League. There was no interleague play at that time. So in 1947, after all of the 20th century and most of Major League Baseball's career, no African Americans whatsoever ever on a team. Now one team in each of the major leagues had one. And this opened a bit of a floodgate early on, in which especially the Indians and the Dodgers, but other teams as well, began going out and recruiting African American players. I say, so what? It's just a few ball players. It was, but obviously very visible people. in society. And it was sort of a crack in the armor a little bit of the rigid color line segregated system in the United States. Not to make too much out of it, but it did lead the way. Equally important was Truman himself, the president, thought that World War II had not only showed African Americans contributing, but showed the basic, not only unfairness, but inefficiency of having a two-tiered segregated armed forces. And one of his big goals was to desegregate the armed forces, but also to address other issues that had always been around during the Jim Crow era, such as unfair blocking of the right to vote, or violence against African Americans, lynching and things. And he appointed a commission, a committee on civil rights to look into the matter, and they did look into the matter, and they took him about 2 years. He appointed him in 1946, and in 1948 they came up with a series of recommendations. You can see them right there. Number 4, the desegregation of the U.S. military. Truman, immediately as this report was offered, issued an executive order of his own, which abolished segregation of the armed forces. And he asked Congress to go ahead and pass civil rights legislation to address those other things. Now, it's seen today as sort of a pioneering breakthrough, but at the time there was great resistance, what came to be known as the white backlash. And the white backlash especially took place in the South. And I think that causes us, looking back as a history thing, to think that the South was the problem. The South was not the problem. The South is where the strict Jim Crow laws existed, where slavery had existed, and where still the vast majority of African Americans lived. And a good case in point is this man on the screen right now, Strom Thurmond. He was governor of South Carolina at the time. He was later senator. He ran for president in 1948, not as a Democrat. He was a Democrat at the time. He later became a Republican. But not as a Democrat, but as a Dixiecrat. And there was a small breakaway from the Democratic Party of Southern Democrats who became Dixiecrats to try to defeat Truman and this wild and crazy idea of expanding civil rights. Well, the Dixiecrat campaign failed, but what it revealed is that this was not going to be some easy thing that, hey, this is the right thing to do, and a solid group of Americans all saying, yeah, you're right, this is the right thing to do. And in fact, there was a solid South against it. And the solid South politically were all Democrats in 1948, 49, and 50. Now, we'll talk a bit later how there was a political revolution that occurred in the presidencies, from the presidencies of Nixon on through Reagan, in which there was a switcheroo of sorts, in which the solid South is still fairly solid, but now it's a solid Republican South, and the Democratic Party is certainly not the party of civil rights, but it's associated with expanding civil rights. And back in 1950, that was not the case. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time walking through all the protests of the civil rights movement, but we do need to understand how it gets started as a movement in the 1950s, not just a couple of ideas floating around out there that this is something we need to do. We've studied this, and you should remember it. 2 court cases. The first was called Williams versus Mississippi, in which the Supreme Court basically said that things like the poll tax or the literacy test didn't violate anyone's right to vote because it was not aimed specifically at any one group of people. No one was named in those laws. It was correlation rather than a direct mention. Certainly, most African Americans were too poor to pay the poll tax, but it didn't specify African Americans, and it specified paying a $2 poll tax. If that eliminated most African Americans, then that's not discriminatory, other than the fact that African Americans needed to earn more money, say. Or the literacy test, learn to read proficiently, and you can vote. Even the grandfather clause, which said if you or an ancestor couldn't vote in 1867, you couldn't vote now, which applied to all ex-slaves, because the 14th and 15th Amendment didn't come until after 1867. Even though that was pretty ironclad, nowhere did it explicitly say so. So it was a correlation. It turns out that all the people that fall into this category, which is just a general category, just happen to be African Americans. And then more famous and more widespread, because it had to do with more than just politics, was, and the one you must remember and know about, is the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, in which the Supreme Court said it's not discrimination if there are facilities for both races to do the same things. And they called that separate but equal. And there was always a question about what equal meant. Is a bucket with a ladle the same as a water fountain? And in the fact that you can get a drink of water from both of them, it is. So it's separate but equal, although obviously not equal. It legalized segregation, separation, and a two-tiered system in which a bucket of water and a water fountain were considered the same facility. And that had been the law of the land since the 1890s. We've also studied the NAACP that was created during the Progressive Era. It was created by white Americans and black Americans with the idea for the advancement of African Americans. And from that time on, 1909 on, the NAACP put much of its efforts into challenging segregation or discrimination in courts of law to try to get these practices rendered illegal through the court system. Failed more times than they succeeded. But in 1954, a court case came to the Supreme Court, and it was the NAACP lawyer, had been their chief lawyer for many years, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first African American on the Supreme Court. And he took up the case of Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas, who couldn't go to the school next to her house, relatively speaking. She had to trek all the way across town to the black school on the outskirts of town. And this case wended its way through the court system and finally up into the Supreme Court of the United States. It's revolutionary. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka is revolutionary in that by a 9-0 unanimous decision, the court ruled that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. Not equal. Not equal. Separate but not equal. The basis of the ruling was set out by the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who basically said in the field of education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. He said that not only is just separating people arbitrarily based on who they are, not anything about them, but just the category, ethnically, racially, or in some other way, makes it unequal on the face of it. But secondly, was that old bucket of water versus water fountain, that the facilities themselves, although both schools, weren't equal anyway. It was a two-tiered system. And the Supreme Court based this ruling on the 14th Amendment, in particular, the Equal Protection Clause, which says that all Americans will enjoy equal protection of the law. And because it was based on the 14th Amendment is not about schools, it's about equal protection of the law, that particular clause. And therefore, this ruling about a school, a specific school, not only would make sense for all schools, but it opened the way for desegregation in other public facilities, say riding a bus, things like that. So that the Brown case is extremely important as a pivot point, 1954. Now, again, there's a tremendous backlash. In the aftermath of the Brown case, 101 Southern members of Congress signed something called the Southern Manifesto, condemning the Brown ruling, pledging to use any means possible, legal means possible, to reverse it. There would be massive resistance against this kind of thing. And again, this is concentrated in the South, and I think it makes us think, looking back, that this was a Southern issue, a continuation of the Civil War in some ways. And in some small way it was, but this is a national issue as well. So, just to belabor the point, the Brown decision specifically applied to public schools, but it's a threat to segregation in all areas of society because of the constitutional basis that was applied, equal protection of the laws. So the Brown decision is identified as the official starting point, if you want to call it that, of the civil rights movement, which is defined as the national effort made by black people and their supporters to eliminate segregation and to gain equal rights in all areas of life. I keep saying this is a national issue, not a Southern issue. And the map, I think, kind of shows that a little bit. There's two Latin phrases, de jure and de facto, and we've talked about them in passing. Jure, jurisprudence, by law, of law. There's segregated legislation, in the South that defined what Jim Crow was. Very explicit laws. You can't go in this doorway. You can't sit in this part of the theater. You have to sit in that part of the theater. You can't go to this doctor. You can go to that doctor. Those kind of things. There were no such laws in the North. There were no such laws in Ohio. But Larry Doby, the Cleveland Indian, in one of the most anti-slavery states before the Civil War there was, couldn't eat with his teammates in Cleveland, Ohio, in a public restaurant because we do not serve African Americans in this restaurant. If you want something to eat, you can get carryout from the kitchen, go around to the alley and back. And so, in fact, de facto segregation existed most places, and de jure, by law, by legislation, segregation existed in mainly the South. So there's two things going on here, but the net result is that although not as strict and not as ruthless in the North, there is segregation and discrimination just as there was elsewhere in the country. There's Larry Doby not getting to eat with his teammates. There were a number of organizations out there, and much like the New Deal program's alphabet soup, it'll become confusing. There was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. There was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. There was a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the SCLC, SNCC. So there were a bunch of, plus the old NAACP. So there were all these organizations, but what we should know that these took the tactic of nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, doing something that is illegal because you are doing it, but is not illegal, such as sitting on a particular seat in the bus. Get on the bus, ride on the bus, but as soon as a white person gets on the bus, you, a black person, have to go and get in the back. So the civil disobedience is to not move from a place you were allowed to sit with no white people aboard, but couldn't sit now that there was. It wasn't in itself, like robbing a bank, an illegal act. It was illegal in this really unfair interpretation of the law. And so we're all familiar with Rosa Parks and how this led to a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, spearheaded by the churches and spearheaded in particular by a young minister who was given the job of heading up the church the African American church response, Martin Luther King Jr. And so it was that the Montgomeryites boycotted the bus, which severely hurt the bus system because African Americans, being poorer, rode the bus more than other citizens. And now, by not riding the bus, it hit the bus system in its bottom line. And they continued this for more than a year, 382 days. And finally, the legal challenge to the bus segregation law worked its way through the courts, and the Supreme Court, 2 years after the Brown decision, said that this was unconstitutional on the same 14th Amendment basis. Now, we're not going to walk through all of these other specific acts of civil disobedience that led to the momentum of the civil rights movement. In some cases, just following what the Supreme Court had said to do, the desegregation of schools. You've heard of the Little Rock Nine, led to violence and opposition and protection by U.S. troops, and the passage of legislation. The idea of going and peaceably sitting at a restaurant or a lunch counter but not being served because you're African American, but continuing to sit as a protest. The idea of getting on a bus in a place where desegregated buses were allowed, say Cleveland, Ohio, and riding that bus to the south and maybe getting out in Montgomery, Alabama, where desegregated bus riding was illegal, and therefore violating the law of Alabama by doing something obviously a legal thing to do. So there were white and black volunteers who got on these buses to desegregate the busing system. Often met with being arrested or violence. Sometimes the buses were firebombed. Sometimes the people were beaten up. But ultimately, the federal law won out. Although reluctant really to open up a can of worms, the Kennedy administration eventually took legal action against the southern cities, and the bus terminals, the buses, the lunch counters became desegregated. And so it went through the 50s and into the 60s, and one crisis point after another. The University of Mississippi was one. When we get to Birmingham, we will want to take a few minutes because it's another pivot point. Like Brown, almost 10 years earlier, this is a pivot point that takes the civil rights movement to a new level. And we'll talk about this another day. But use the notes that'll be posted for you, which I just kind of ran through briefly, to find out further information to guide your reading in the book. And we'll talk again soon.